Ready when you are.
Alright guys, we're going to get started now. Right. So first, join me in welcoming Professor Jeffry Frieden. Professor Frieden is a professor of international relations at Harvard University. He focuses on the international finance aspects, currency rates, interest rates, that sort of nature. Just came out with a new book titled Currency Politics, the Political Economy of Exchange Rate Policy. So the format is just going to be like a Q&A, sort of open question based. So there's this event at 3 o'clock hosted by the Economics Student Association. And then at 7 o'clock, just across the hall, he's going to be having his formal lecture. So I'm just going to start off the questioning by saying, give some background and what sort of led you into the world of international finance.
Personal background, if you want. Yeah. Okay. Well, so I was actually in graduate school in the early 1980s and had always been interested in the intersection of politics and economics. In fact, when I was an undergraduate, took a lot of economics, as I did as a graduate student as well, and was very torn about whether to go into economics or into political science. At the time, but what I knew was that I was interested in the intersection of the two. I was interested in trying to understand why governments made the economic policies that they did, why politics looked the way that it did, always with regard to economic issues. I mean, I was never interested, don't tell me, I was never really interested in the pure political things, even whether it was diplomacy or whether incumbents have an advantage in congressional elections or how they choose congressional committees, all that stuff. I've gotten more interested since then just because, you live with political scientists, you gotta learn their language. But I was always really only interested in the making of economic policy, trying to understand the making of economic policy. And at that point in economics, there was no political economy. That is, you really couldn't do that in economics, but you could in political science, which was more open to new ways of doing things. That's changed, as you might know. Political economy is extremely hot in economics. It's one of the hottest fields in graduate economics. So today, if I were a graduate student today, or undergraduate or graduate student today, I probably would have been an economics major rather and would have gotten the economics degree. But in those days, it was in political science. So finance, well, I think this goes back. You're plumbing the depths of my personal self-analysis. But I grew up in New York. I was always fascinated with American history. My hero as a teenager growing up was Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was the most economically literate of the founding fathers. He was the founder of the Bank of New York. He was the country's first Secretary of the Treasury. He reorganized New York City finances and reorganized America's finances in extremely important ways. And you can't grow up in New York and not have some awareness of what's going on in the financial markets. And that layered on that general interest in banking, finance, history was the fact that in the midst of, as I was an undergraduate and then starting graduate school, there was this really, for the first time in 50 years, this huge boom in lending to developing countries. Right? So developing countries had been frozen out of international financial markets from 1929 on. And then all of a sudden, starting around 1970, the big American and European and Japanese banks started lending hundreds of what was then a lot of money, hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars. Now it seems like nothing, but it was a lot of money in those days, to the developing countries, and that was very new. And so I got very interested in that and what the implications were. In the midst of being in graduate school, it all blew up with the Latin American debt crisis. So it was a little bit like in some sense, your generation, growing up in the midst of the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression. I grew up in the midst of the biggest debt crisis since the Great Depression, or grew up intellectually, and so that reinforced my interest in international finance. So that's where I got into it, but it's a little hard. That's as close as I can come to actually coming up with an explanation. Anybody want to know about my early childhood?
All right, so I had a econometrics paper that I had to do. And my topic was how monetary policy impacts inflation rate. And that got me more interested in it, and I started looking at, I think around 1960s, we started targeting a lower inflation rate with our monetary policies and everything. And I started realizing that our economic recovery from it was slower, so I wanted to know what your opinion was the lower inflation target rate.
Okay, well, let me try to deconstruct or reconstruct your question. I think maybe what you're referring to is the change in monetary policy after 1979.
Yeah.
So under the Bretton Woods International Monetary System, which ruled from World War II up until 1971 to 73, countries' currencies were locked together with fixed rates. And it was and the dollar was fixed to gold at $35 per ounce. And that was a system that had many advantages and some disadvantages, but one of the advantages was that it essentially provided or locked us into low inflation. And we did have relatively low inflation throughout that entire period. In 1971, the Bretton Woods system blew up. And by 73, we had moved to a new system where currencies were no longer pegged to one another and the dollar was no longer pegged to gold. That allowed governments, especially in the difficult economic times of the 70s, you had the oil crisis, you had recessions, you had a lot of very high unemployment rates. That allowed governments to run more expansionary monetary policies, and we ended up with some rip-roaring inflation. Inflation into the double digits in almost every developed country. And periods in the US where it seemed like the inflation rate was starting to spiral out of control, looking almost like a Latin American country where it was heading towards 20% and seemed to be getting higher and higher and higher. So in 1979, faced with this inflationary crisis and a loss of confidence in the dollar, Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker as the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And it was understood, Volcker had been a banker and had been at the New York Fed and was understood to be what we would now call an inflation hawk. That is someone who really was intent on bringing inflation down. And the markets took that as a good signal, but he didn't do anything for a little while. And then having assessed the situation, Volcker, as Carter had intended him to do, came out with an announcement which essentially said that the Fed was going to pursue a monetary policy that would effectively guarantee a substantial reduction in inflation no matter how high interest rates went, right? That's simplifying wildly from what the theoretical and analytical justification or argumentation was, but this was understood by the markets to mean that the Fed was serious about fighting inflation. And then Volcker went about proving it. Interest rates shot up to about 22%, right, in the course of less than a year.
What year was that again?
Pardon me?
What year was that?
1981. So by the time, 81, this is happening, he was appointed by Carter in 79, the policy is implemented late in 79, takes effect in 80. I mean, to the credit of Carter, he appointed a man at the Fed whom he knew would cause a recession and probably lose him the 1980 election, right? But he did it maybe because he had no choice. There was so much loss of confidence in the government. But in any event, so by 1980, interest rates are skyrocketing, and we enter into a very deep recession in 1981, as unemployment goes up to 11, 12%. But with these extremely high interest rates, it brings inflation down. It also bankrupted Latin America for reasons that we can go into if people are interested. But that was not Paul Volcker's concern. So it brought inflation down and kept it down. So Volcker and the Fed really, not only did they have to prove that they were serious about bringing inflation down, they had to prove they were serious about keeping it down. Especially in an environment, as you may know, at the same time as this is happening on the monetary policy front, Ronald Reagan comes in as president, there are substantial tax cuts, and the government starts running huge deficits, right? So normally we think of deficits as being inflationary. Normally we think, well, the government's running a big deficit, they're going to be monetized, there'll be inflation. But instead what happened was, because the Fed is so intent on fighting inflation, interest rates are so high, the budget deficit is almost entirely financed by borrowing from the rest of the world, right? So it's not inflationary. So you get this big fiscal deficit, which leads to an economic expansion. But because monetary policy is very tight, like being anti-inflationary, inflation stays very low. And by the mid-'80s, I would say, the Fed had established a credible anti-inflationary stance, and there was a broad view in the markets and everywhere that the Fed was committed to low inflation for the duration. And so that restored faith in the dollar, restored some faith in the macroeconomy more generally and in monetary stability. So that's the beginning of the story. I can't exactly remember your question, but I'll pretend I remember. So if you fast forward a bit into the 20 years even, by the 1990s, early 2000s, people look around and look back. And something analogous is happening in Europe, by the way. Europe had very high inflation. By the mid to late 80s, they too had established very strongly, a very credible anti-inflationary regime. So by the late 90s or early aughts, the general feeling was that this had become the new normal, the new state of things. It was called at the time the Great Moderation. Right? Under those circumstances, central banks moved to a new, and this may be something else you're referring to a new form of doing monetary policy called inflation targeting, which is where you set a target, say 2%, and say our target is to keep inflation near 2%, and we're going to hold to that. Right? Given the fact that we've been able to beat inflation, right, economies are growing, productivity is changing, relative prices are changing. We don't think that prices should that all prices should stay the same all the time, but we think that targeting an inflation rate of 2% is feasible. We're going to do that. And so central banks went to this pattern of inflation targeting, which again seemed quite successful. Things have changed. And what's changed is that in the midst of what was supposed to be a long-term commitment to moderation and stable economic growth, we experienced massive credit booms, massive bubbles in many asset markets, and the biggest crash since 1929. And in part because of political gridlock in the US and even bigger political gridlock in Europe, the principal response to the recession, to the great financial crisis, was not fiscal policy, which most economists I think would have said would have been the appropriate response, or one of the appropriate responses, but the main response was from central banks, monetary policy. So central banks found themselves in being really the only, or in the case of Europe, the only, and in the case of the US, practically the only instrument of economic policy to try to get us out of this worst recession since the 1930s. And that led central banks to do things that they'd never imagined doing before, in the case of the Fed and now the ECB, to engage in what's called quantitative easing, which essentially means going into the market and buying trillions of dollars worth of debts, which may not be all that great, right? The consequence is that, or the consequence has been that this monetary policy has taken on a much, much broader remit, much, much broader set of goals than had been envisioned under inflation targeting or under the previous regime of great moderation. And it really does raise questions about what the future will bring, the future of monetary policy, the future of macroeconomics. I don't know if that doesn't answer, but it opens up more questions than answers.
What I was noticing though, when I was doing my research, is that in the past recessions before they started, not exactly just targeting, but more aiming for the lower inflation rates. Back when the inflation rate was around 4 or 5%, that the economic recovery, based on the standards of the Federal Reserve, that they were significantly in almost every single category faster back
Absolutely.
then. So, why do you think this idea is a good idea for the low inflation targeting?
So here's the central crucial point that you should all keep in mind. And I would say almost, if you only remember one thing from today, from talking from me, this is it. That is that the recovery, and this is just building on what you said, in the US, in the UK, in Europe, the recovery from the great financial crisis has been extraordinarily slow. I mean like an order of magnitude slower. So the average, if you look at all American recessions since the 1930s, since the Great Depression of the 1930s, typically it takes between 6 and 9 months after the recession bottoms out for employment to recover to pre-recession levels, right? We are now 7 years now past the recession bottoming out, and employment has still not gotten back to pre-recession levels, right? So instead of 6 to 9 months, it's 7 years, and some of the projections are already 10 years. Right? In Europe, Europe is in even worse shape, right? So another way of doing this is, what is how has output responded after the recovery? So if you look at, we're about 7 years since the beginning, 7.5 years since the beginning of the crisis, December 2007, so let's call it 7.5 years since the beginning of the crisis. Right now, GDP in the US is 5–6% above where it was when the crisis began. Now that's a bad thing, because if you think of an output gap, if you know what an output gap is, we should have been growing at 3% a year throughout those years, 2 or 3 or even 4% a year. We're still way below from where we could or should have been without it. But still, our GDP is now 5, 6, 7% above where it was when the crisis started. Right? In Europe, GDP is 5, 6% below where it was when the crisis started still. Right? And just to give you a comparison, that means that the last 7.5 years in Europe have been worse than the 1930s. Because by 1936, the European economies had recovered and gone beyond where they were in 1929. And today they have not. Right? So this recovery has been very substantially slower than typical recoveries in a typical cyclical recession. A typical cyclical recession, not 6–9 months and you're out. And that's because this is not a typical cyclical recession. This is a very, very different kind of crisis. And it is, to put it in the simplest possible terms, it's a debt crisis. It's a debt crisis like the one I was talking about before, like the one that Latin America went through, like the ones we're used to seeing in countries like Thailand or Brazil or Malaysia or Peru, where a country borrows a whole lot of money from the rest of the world, doesn't invest it very wisely, right? Experiences a big expansion, a boom, and a bubble, and it bursts, and it takes a long time to recover. And you may have heard the term lost decade. The first lost decade in the modern era is Latin America in the 1980s and 90s. Right? A second lost decade is the financial crisis in Japan, 1990s and on. And we're now in the midst of a third episode of lost decades. In the US, we've already lost a decade. The Europeans have lost a decade and stand on the brink of losing another. Right? So why are debt crises so different? Why are debt crises so different from normal recessions? And the simple and relatively easy answer, which I'll, in the spirit of social science, make more complicated, the simple answer is that debt crises leave societies with a massive burden of accumulated debt. The normal recession is cyclical, right? But a debt crisis means that the country has borrowed enormous amounts of money, the crisis hits, and the debts are still there. So why does that matter? So the term typically used for this is called the debt overhang. Why is the debt overhang? The debt overhang exercises a tremendous economic drag on society, and then also has massive political implications. So first on the economics, why are debt crises different economically? Well, the accumulated debts have effects on creditors and on debtors. So think of it from the standpoint of the creditors, right? So whether in the US or in Europe, you're stuck, this is anticipating someone I'm going to say tonight, but it doesn't matter. So you're stuck with the creditors now, are stuck with trillions of dollars worth of debts, some of which they know are bad, and a lot of which they are worried are bad. So if you're a financial institution in this condition, the last thing you're going to do is make new loans. What you're trying to do is shed all these bad loans and restore some balance to your portfolio, or deleverage it, right? So financial institutions, faced with this debt overhang, are in the business of trying to get rid of their bad debt and hold on to only the highest quality debt. And to the extent that they're making new loans, to make loans only to the highest quality borrowers. The general rule of banking is you only lend money to people who don't need it, right? And especially if you've got a lot of bad debts on your books, you're not going to make a lot of questionable loans. So banks aren't lending. From the standpoint of the consumer, households have faced a series of very, very serious shocks. They've had a shock to their income, almost certainly. They may have had a bout of unemployment. They've had a shock to their assets, their investments, their retirement savings, and a shock to their principal asset, which is their home value. Right? So we can think of this by taking the average American household. These are roughly correct figures, just estimated. Average American household as of 2006, 2007, before the crisis, couple in their early 50s, kids out of the house, with a home paid off, worth about $200,000, and about $200,000 in retirement savings. Right? And they look forward 15 years or so to retirement, and they say, given expectations, this $200,000 in retirement savings will be enough for us to live on in 15 years when we retire. and given the value of the home, we'll be able to sell the house, move to Florida, or buy a condo, we don't need the big house, and we'll be fine. They wake up one morning in January 2009 or December 2008, and their retirement savings, instead of being worth $200,000, are worth $120,000, and their home, instead of being worth $200,000, is also worth $120,000. They've still got the same target for retirement. They want to retire in 15 years, and they want to have an income that they can live off of. Right? So they still have the same target for retirement, but now how are they going to meet it? Well, they have to save a lot more. The only way you can save more is by consuming less. And so when the crisis hits, because the debtors, the debts that they owe are still there. They still have to pay off these debts, the mortgage debt or other debts. So consumers cut back on their consumption in order to be able to service their debts, right? And to save more for future purposes. So we have banks not lending and consumers not spending. And that's the effect of the debt overhang. And that's why on the economic front, the recoveries are as slow as they are. But there's another side, which in some ways, especially if you think of Europe, is even more important. And that is political. Every debt crisis that I know of, and I would venture to say every debt crisis in history, ends up with massive political conflicts over how the burden of adjustment will be distributed. That is, you've got a society with all these debts, and the question that the political system has to confront is, how's it going to be dealt with? Right? Who's going to make the sacrifices necessary to deal with the accumulated debts? And this is especially the case in foreign debt crises. There typically are two dimensions of division, two dimensions of conflict. One is international. So you've got creditor countries saying we want our money back, and debtor countries saying we can't pay, right? And threatening not to pay. And so we see that in the European Union today, where it's Germany against Greece or the Netherlands against Portugal, creditor countries who clearly want to get paid as much as possible, and debtor countries who want their debts to be restructured, as would normally be the case in most bankruptcies, but these are companies, they're countries. So what happens is political conflict. But then there is political conflict within the countries over who within the country is going to pay this debt burden. So if you go to a place like Portugal or Spain or Ireland or Greece, one of the debtor countries, some of the big issues are, okay, whatever we end up having to pay to our creditors, whose pockets are going to come out of? Is it going to come out of government employees? Is it going to come out of taxpayers? Is it going to come out of the beneficiaries of government programs? Is it going to come out of the rich? Is it going to come out of the private sector? Who's going to make the sacrifices necessary to service this debt burden? Right? And we saw that in the U.S., and there still is conflict over this in the U.S. You know, to what extent should the crisis be dealt with by restructuring mortgages? To what extent should the banks be responsible for making some of these irresponsible loans? To what extent should it be the burden should be on the homeowners? To what extent should banks be forced to write off some of these loans? To what extent should the government get involved in trying to restructure this debt? To what extent should some of the recovery be aided by fiscal policy, which will eventually be paid for by taxpayers, et cetera, et cetera? In Europe, and so it was pretty conflictual here, and remains pretty conflictual, but Europe is just, you know, way beyond us in the degree of conflict. As those of you who follow European politics know, the extent of political polarization in Europe is just, it's at its greatest level since the 1930s. You know, you have in most countries, not especially the most heavily hit, the hardest hit countries, the debtor countries in Europe, you have the rise of extremist parties of all types, you have a fracturing of the political system, you have mass protests, you have very worrisome political developments because these societies have not resolved the question of how they will distribute the burden of dealing with the debt, the accumulated debt. Right? And that, of course, that kind of gridlock makes it very difficult for governments to undertake systematic and effective policies to address the crisis. I mean, it seems strange to say, but the European response makes the U.S. look pretty good. Right? I mean, yes, we went through some very difficult times, and there was a lot of debate and a lot of confusion, and we could still argue over whether the response of the government was optimal. Certainly wasn't optimal, but whether the response of the government was good. But the reality is that we're now growing. You know, we did pursue fiscal stimulus, we did pursue monetary stimulus. There was a general agreement on how it should be distributed. There was a general agreement on restructuring of the banks. There was a general agreement on financial re-regulation. All of them controversial. We could argue about any and all of them. But the fact is that Europe hasn't done any of that. Right? So now they're still stuck in stagnation, and we're growing again. Right? That was a long answer to a short question. As I can talk for virtually forever if given the opportunity.
Yeah, no, but just today I read that Greece, with the austerity measures implemented from Germany, they were saying that Germany still owes them reparations from World War II, amounting to 300 billion.
Right.
And Germany's saying this is ridiculous, that this was settled in, I forget the year the treaty was signed, but
I think in the 50s.
From the 50s,
I'm not
I
sure.
believe.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, this is all part of the bargaining.
part of the
Right.
process.
So, for those of you who haven't followed this, of course, Greece is a little bit of a special case. So I don't want to go into too much detail about it. I will if people are interested. But the Greek government, the borrowing by Greece, unlike the other European countries, was almost exclusively by the Greek government. And the Greek government was essentially lying about its economic statistics. So it was a conservative government, it lost the election, and a new socialist government came in, and one of the first things they did, I think they figured it would help them, make them look good, because they were being, as they said, the previous government has been lying about statistics, our budget deficit is not 4% of GDP, it's 15% of GDP, and instead of making the new government look good, what happened was the markets went crazy and said, oh my God, they're never going to be able to pay this money back, and there was a run on Greek debt, and the country just collapsed.
Right.
And there's been this continuing attempt for the last 5 years to try to bring Greece up to some level of solvency, which I think is, their opinions vary, but I think is almost certainly impossible without a massive write-off of the debt. There's been a substantial write-off, but the debts are still so burdensome that it's hard to imagine that the Greek economy can grow at all without some substantial restructuring. The restructuring is the polite name.
Yeah.
It really is just writing off the debt. Now, as you can imagine, the people who are owed this money don't much like that. And a lot of the people who are owed this money are Germans. There are also Finns and Dutch and Belgians and French, but the Germans are the biggest creditors, and so both private and public. And so this then comes down to the kind of conflict I was talking about before. The Germans say, you should be imposing austerity on, you, the Greeks, should be imposing austerity on your economy so that you can generate the resources to service your debts. And the Greeks say, for us to generate the kind of resources that we need to service these debts means keeping us in with 25% unemployment and in conditions worse than the Great Depression for the next 10 years, and our political and social system can't sustain that. We've already got a neo-Nazi party on the right and an extreme left party which is now in government on the left, and this is going to tear apart the society. We can't do it, right? And so I think there's, at the higher levels in European, maybe not at the mass level, but at the higher levels, there's a recognition that the current situation is not sustainable, that it's almost, would be almost impossible for really any government to do what is being asked of the Greek government, but there's still questions about how much it should be asked to do, right? And the Greeks, of course, the Greeks are going to say, you should forgive all the debt, right? If you don't forgive all the debt, we'll go to hell in a handbasket. And that's not credible. So the bargaining is all about how much should the Greeks pay and how much should the rest of the Europeans forgive, right? That's the battle. In the midst of this, so for those of you who follow this, what happened is that a new left-wing Greek party was formed called Syriza. I have no idea what that means in Greek, someone might, but a new Greek party was formed, which was generally thought of as being quite left-wing. And it won the election, came to power, and actually, once in power, started quite rapidly moving much more towards the center and trying to reassure the business community and the rest of the European Union that they weren't going to be crazy, and were somewhat successful, but they still are bargaining hard with the rest of Europe, and especially with the Germans, and they pull out stops when they can. So the Germans take a hardline position on the Greeks, and the Greeks say, yeah, but what about the Nazis?
What about that?
It's a pretty good bargaining chip. What about the Nazis? You got you occupied Greece and you slaughtered a lot of people and you owe us a lot of money still. And it turns out, actually, I was reading in the Financial Times, a German lawyer had a column in the I think it was the Financial Times or maybe something the Wall Street Journal, that said that actually there is some justification to this Greek claim. There are some unsettled claims left over from World War II. But clearly, they didn't just happen to be raised in the midst of this negotiations by coincidence, right? You know? So it's you know what it reminds me. Those of you sitting up here will not get this reference, but it reminds me, because I just saw it again, of the scene in Dog Day Afternoon where Al Pacino is in the bank and the police surrounding him, and he runs out and says, "Attica, Attica, Attica." You know, completely irrelevant to what's going on, but it got the crowd's attention away from him and onto the police. So in some sense, this focus on reparations is a way of taking attention away from the basic financial issue and trying to, I mean, this is a little unfair, trying to guilt trip the Germans into maybe more concessions. That's not going to make a big difference. What's going to make a big difference, I think, in negotiations is how can I put it? The two things that would make the biggest difference were the Greek government being able to commit credibly to undertake serious reforms.
Stricter regulations on the tax code, or enforcing it.
So I'll come back to what kinds of reforms. And the second would be a credible commitment on the part of the creditors to restructure some of the debt, which they could do. I mean, part of the problem the Greeks face, if you read the articles about this, is they're going to run out of money in the next month. I mean, because they have debt payments due. So it would not be difficult for the European creditors to say, we're going to take the money that you owe. I mean, these payments are bunched. You know, they're not. It's like if you have a bunch, you have car payments and homeowners payments and credit card payments, and they all have to come due in 1 month. Well, you can sometimes go to the creditors and say, can we string them out over the next 2 years? And so it would not be difficult for the Europeans to say, okay, we understand that this is bunching. We're going to string them out over the next 5 years. You're still going to pay us back, but we're going to maybe bring the interest rate down a little bit and extend the maturities. So that's really where the Europeans are saying, we don't want to do that because then we lose a lot of bargaining power with the Greeks. If they know that they're going to run out of money in 4 weeks, they're under pressure to undertake these reforms. And the Greeks say, we know that they realize we can't make these payments, so if we just wait a few weeks, they'll be forced to restructure. It's a game of chicken. Right? Yeah. About the reforms, there's an interesting aspect of this, which is, you know, austerity is never popular. And the Europeans have been focusing not so much on austerity, which is a short-term thing, but on reforming the Greek economy, which everyone agrees is extremely inefficient and needs reform. An interesting thing about Syriza is it's an extreme left party. It had no ties with the previous political classes. The previous political class, I'm not offending any Greeks in the audience, but the previous political classes were pretty corrupt. And Greece had this kind of very powerful oligarchy, mostly shipping magnates and financial institutions, and a lot of monopolies that were supported by the government, and a lot of really bad stuff in the Greek economy. But an interesting thing about Syriza is because it's made up of these extreme leftists, they don't have any ties to these people. So they actually can say, yeah, we'll break up the monopolies. We'll break up the shipping monopolies and we'll get these oligarchs out of power. So there is an overlap between the kinds of policies that the Europeans might like and what Syriza can actually accomplish. Where the sticking point comes is largely in labor, because Syriza has a lot of support from labor, and among the reforms that the Europeans are demanding are liberalization of labor regulations and a reduction of very pro-labor policies in the public sector and things like that. But there are policies that they could probably agree on implementing. Yeah?
Something near to your heart. Why the White House is concerned about the European allies signing up with the Chinese bank?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a little background for those who don't know. A couple of months ago, I guess it was, the Chinese announced the creation of a new development bank, which they've called it an infrastructure bank. But for all intents and purposes, it looks a lot like the World Bank. Right? Looks like it would do things a lot like the World Bank. And for those of you who don't know, the way the World Bank operates and the way this bank would operate is the World Bank goes into the major credit markets, like goes to Wall Street or Tokyo or Singapore or London, and borrows with the guarantee of the local government. So when the World Bank goes to Wall Street, it floats bonds that are guaranteed by the US government, right? Which means it gets a very low interest rate. So the World Bank gets these bonds with very low interest rates, and then it turns around and re-lends the money to developing countries that would not be able to borrow at those low interest rates, right? And it also provides technical expertise and support, and typically the World Bank loans come with conditions, right? So you can't just take the World Bank money and spend it on whatever you want. You have to say, we have done an engineering study, there's a hydroelectric power plant that we want to build, that hydroelectric power plant is going to be important for the development of agriculture, and so there are a lot of conditions associated with this, and then the World Bank has technical teams that will go out and try to make sure that the country is abiding by these conditions. So, the Chinese set up this bank, and I think it would be fair to say that there are two overlapping or parallel reasons why the bank is appealing to China and also to many other developing countries. The first is that, unlike the World Bank, the bank would be dominated by developing countries. Right? The World Bank is essentially run by the rich countries. It's set up in such a way that the rich countries run the show. Right? So we go by developing countries, and that might have geopolitical or diplomatic implications, but it also might have implications for the kinds of loans the bank would give, which countries it would be willing to lend money to, et cetera, et cetera. And there might be some purely political things. So you can be pretty sure that the World Bank, because the rich countries dominate it, has certain strictures on lending to dictatorships, for example. I doubt highly the Chinese will have a lot of compunction about lending to dictatorships, right? So there's a sort of a political component to this, in that sense, or a diplomatic component. The other component is that over the course of the last 20 years, the conditions that the World Bank has been imposing on a lot of its project lending have become stricter and stricter. And they've become stricter and stricter in ways that a lot of Americans probably would like, right? But a lot of people in developing countries don't like. So the ways that it's become stricter, just to take some examples, are before you could build this hydroelectric power plant that I was just talking about, or the dam, dam for flood control, under current World Bank rules, you'd have to do a study of its environmental impact to make sure that it was not destroying biodiversity in the area. You'd have to do a study of its impact on surrounding populations and have to make sure that the surrounding populations were consulted with in a democratic process. And the World Bank actually will go out and run village meetings to make sure that there's a democratic process involved in this project. You have to make sure that it's not having an adverse effect on the poorest of the farmers in the area. You have to make sure that the energy that's provided is going to be used in a way which is consistent with democratic principles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of the pressure that activists in the North have put on their own governments, on the World Bank, have been effective. So the World Bank now pays a lot of attention to things like democratic responsiveness and accountability and the environment and women's rights and things like that, things that Americans, I think, in general, think are a good thing, but that are extremely unpopular in the developing world. In many developing countries, people regard this as a new form of imperialism. And will say, look, we have farmers who are starving. We have a population on the brink of starvation. We have a population that's growing more rapidly than we can feed them. And you're telling us that we can't do this project because it's gonna eliminate one species of snail darter? That's ridiculous, right? And so the Chinese proposal is essentially to move away from those kinds of conditions, and makes it very popular with many developing countries. Recognizing this, most developed countries have signed on, but the US has not, and has, I think, been losing the battle. Because just about every other developed country has signed on. I think my guess, and this is just a speculation, my guess is that the Obama administration and Congress, I mean this move had support in Congress as well, miscalculated the attractiveness of the new bank and miscalculated the unpopularity of American influence over the World Bank. So my guess is, again, that over the course of the next 5 or 10 years, the U.S. and the World Bank itself is going to have to make amends and find some way of cooperating with this new bank, because it's going to be a going concern. The Chinese have more money than we do right now, so they're going to be able to finance this bank, and it will be a going concern.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you mention ECB reducing their minimum reserve requirements?
Say it again.
I'm sorry, the ECB reducing their minimum reserve requirements, along with like negative rates in the short term with the ECB?
Right. So the ECB, the European Central Bank, which of course is the central bank for the euro, has gone through a series of phases in response to the crisis. In the immediate aftermath of the crisis, when the general feeling was that this was an American crisis and Europe was just feeling the backwash of it, Trichet, who was the president of the ECB at the time, kept fairly tight rein on monetary policy, and so interest rates were pretty high. By 2010, it was clear that this was not just an American crisis. Partly because of the debt crisis that I was talking about, the European economy started spiraling downward. There was a lot of pressure on the ECB to loosen monetary policy. It gradually loosened it, but things did not change dramatically until Mario Draghi came in as the new president of the ECB in 2012, and in a very famous press conference said that the ECB would do what it takes to save the euro. That was interpreted as meaning that it would bring interest rates as low as necessary and even eventually engage in quantitative easing. Draghi did bring interest rates down to zero, down close to zero, in an attempt to try to loosen monetary policy. It was largely unsuccessful in the sense, it was more successful than previous policies, but it was unsuccessful in that Europe, certainly they were pushing for about a 2% inflation rate. They never got close to that, and in some quarters they fell into deflation. And as I was saying before, the European economy not only did not recover, but entered into really a third recession, right, after 2007. So 2007, 2010, 2012, 13. Faced with this continuing failure of the European recovery, Draghi and the ECB resolved to undertake something akin to what the US, the Fed, had done, which was quantitative easing. That is, that they would go into the markets and buy up a lot of existing debt instruments, right? And just for those who, since everybody else is micro here, for those who don't get the connection, you go into the market and buy up a lot of debt instruments, that's putting cash in the hands of the investors, right? And the hope is, or cash in the hands of banks, let's say. And so let's assume for the moment that these are individual investors who are selling off these instruments, these bonds. The investors now have cash, and the hope is that they'll spend some of it, and that will increase spending, right? So by going into the markets and buying up, this is what the Fed did, by going into the markets and buying up what's expected to be something on the order of between 1 and 2 trillion euro worth of instruments, of debt instruments, asset-backed securities and covered bonds and things like that, there will be a stimulative effect on the economy. And that's what the ECB is doing. The reserve requirement is the same thing. You know, if you lower the reserve requirements, banks can do more lending. So they're trying to, all of these measures are aimed at trying to get European banks to lend more money. The early returns are mixed. The European economy has done better in the last 6 months than it did in the previous 6 months, but it is still stagnant. So there are real questions as to how, again, it comes back to how much can monetary policy alone do. Right? I mean, if you want the simplest comparison between the American response and the European response, the simplest comparison is that in the American case, we had a response that included a fiscal policy response and a monetary policy response. And in Europe, the response has been almost entirely monetary policy, and that's not enough. But given the absence of any agreement, so we have the advantage of having one country. Right? So there are automatic ways, and if people are interested, I can go into, when I talk about fiscal policy, I'm not just talking about the fiscal stimulus, the stimulus package. I'm talking about automatic characteristics of fiscal policy in the US. Europe is a lot of countries, and there has been really no effective European fiscal response to the crisis, even at the national level. So the policy response in Europe has been much weaker, and the recovery has been much weaker. Draghi and the ECB are trying to make up for the weakness of this policy response by more aggressive expansionary monetary policy. It's having some effect, but it's probably not going to have as much effect as they would like. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, definitely.
yes.
So I'm predominantly interested in international trade and economic development. You mentioned earlier lesser developed countries gaining more interest and more of a role into the financial markets, and later on the capital account. So there's the current account where it's, you know, the trade in goods and services, and then there's the capital account and trade in financial assets, direct foreign investment. Is it necessarily better or easier for LDCs to develop and grow by use of one more over the other?
I think, so the pure normative theory of development along these lines would be that the two are closely linked, and that there is both a direct economic relationship, and there should be a direct economic relationship. And that is, developing countries are scarce in capital, and they should be borrowing, either borrowing or attracting foreign direct investment. The counterpart of importing capital is running a trade deficit, right? And so, yes, it is the case that countries should be trying to export and should be importing capital to help their economic development. So the simple picture of the way, so if you want your classical textbook picture of what economic development should look like, and there are countries that come close to it. I mean, the US in the 19th century looks like this, right? And countries that have been more successful, like the Koreas and Taiwans, and to some extent some Latin American, Chile and others, what they look like is they use a lot of foreign capital to expand their productive capacity, to expand their ability, their auto factories, or their salmon fisheries, or their copper mines, or their microchip factories. And they help pay for the borrowing that they've done by exporting large portions of what they're producing. Right? The crucial nexus there is that if you're bringing in foreign capital, if you're borrowing from the rest of the world, you're using it for productive purposes. Right? The last thing you want to do is borrow, if you're a poor country, even if you're a rich country, the last thing you want to do is borrow from the rest of the world and use it for current consumption, right? Because that's not increasing the productive capacity of the country. And you can think about it in a variety of ways. If you bring capital into the country, you want it to increase the country's productive capacity, because then it will be able to generate the resources to service its debts. Right? By the same token, you want it not only to increase the productive capacity of the country, you want it to increase the ability of the country to export. Because when you borrow from, if you're Peru or Chile and you're borrowing from the rest of the world, you're probably borrowing in dollars, not in soles or pesos, right? So you have to earn dollars to service that debt. So successful experiences along these lines involve countries that borrow, use the money for productive investment, or for things that are going to encourage productive investment, like infrastructure and stuff like that, increase their productive capacity, increase their exports, and everybody's better off. It's a little bit like, borrowing's not bad. When GE borrows, people don't say, oh my God, it's terrible, GE's borrowing money. What they say is, what are they doing with the money? If GE borrows at 5% and invests in a project that pays 10%, then GE is better off and the lender's better off as well. If Chile or Korea or Peru borrow at 5% and invest in activities that pay off 10 or 15%, then both borrowers and lenders are better off. So it's that mix of using capital wisely and using it in part to expand the export capacity of the country that I think is, if we look at the really true success stories of the last 50 years of development, or 60 years of development, which would be Korea and Taiwan, Singapore, and to some extent even within Europe, Ireland, which was a very poor country in the 50s and now one of the richest in Europe, Portugal to a certain extent, many countries in Central and Eastern Europe that started off quite poor and have done well. All of them have this characteristic of having relied very heavily on foreign capital to finance a lot of their investment, whether it's direct investment or borrowing, and being very heavily oriented towards exports.
I got a little short question.
Okay.
We went back to that China's national bank and whatnot. So you obviously discussed environmental restrictions, how they would obviously be a lot lessened and everything.
Sure.
Do you think this would increase, if America did end up deciding to join this national bank, do you think this would increase foreign direct investment, and would this affect the dumping? You know how the national bank, the World Bank, has made a lot of restrictions on dumping. Do you think this would because I haven't read very much on it, would this affect that at all, or?
Well, we don't really know, because the bank is very, very new and not in operation really. So we don't really know what will happen. I think having talked to some Europeans about their attitude is, their view is it's better to be inside the tent than outside it. And so I think the hope would be, if the U.S. does join, and certainly there are other European countries and others that have joined, that they will be able to exercise some influence on the policies of the bank. But it remains to be seen. And you have to think that it's going to be different for the World Bank, because to the extent that China, Brazil, India have a major role, I mean, it's the BRICS, so-called, that have a major role in the creation of this bank. Their policy proclivities are pretty different from the US, Germany, Japan, the UK. So it's going to be different. How different is not clear. I think almost all developing countries these days, unlike 30 years ago, are very eager to attract foreign direct investment. So I think it's unlikely that this is a bank that will in any way be hostile to foreign direct investment. There is some interesting speculation that it might serve, so typically we think of foreign direct investment as flowing from rich countries to poor countries. You know, sort of Volkswagen investing in Brazil, or GE investing in Malaysia. But one of the newer phenomena is so-called South-South foreign direct investment, where a Brazilian company invests in Africa, especially in the former Portuguese colonies in the Portuguese-speaking Africa. So the Brazilian oil company is very active in Angola, or Mexico invests in Indonesia, the Mexican company invests in Indonesia, or what's very common now is Chinese companies investing in Africa or other parts of Asia. So it may well be that one of the things that this bank will focus on is South-South foreign direct investment. That would be a logical inference to draw from the fact that it really is a South-South bank.
Yeah. Don't you think this would make negative impacts on like domestic workers though? Because now, some of the environmental laws that were put on by the World Bank, you have to invest extra to make sure that you're disposing of this waste in a better way, or you're doing something like that. This takes those costs off, so don't you think people, companies will be more keen to go?
So we don't know, but let me make a counter argument without, taking a position on this. So what many people in developing countries might say to you in response to a position like that would be twofold. First of all, your concern about the environment is charming, but it's not realistic.
No, it's not.
It's not realistic. It's not realistic for a country that is facing the possibility of famine or starvation or mass poverty. The alternative, we can't be asked to choose between biodiversity and prosperity for our people. Or if we are made to choose, we're going to choose prosperity over biodiversity. The Brazilians had, at a time when they were coming under a lot of criticism for what was happening in the Amazon, the Brazilians said, I think this, perfectly justifiably, said, look, if you people in America, in the United States, North America, and Europe are so eager and intent on preserving biodiversity in the Amazon, why don't you pay for it? Just give us the money to preserve biodiversity in the Amazon. Why are you telling us to pay for it? If it's a global public good, if it's a global resource, then the globe should pay for it, right? The other thing, the Chinese have said this many times, and again, this comes up in a lot of debates over climate change and greenhouse gases. They said, it's really interesting. You guys went for 150 years industrializing without paying any attention to the impact that your industrialization was having on the rest of the world and on the ecology and everything else. And now that all the industry is in our countries, you turn around and say, gee, look at all the terrible stuff you're doing, you got to stop it. So it's like, you get rich and then you make it hard for anyone else to get rich. So those are the kind of normative arguments that you get into. But I think there has been something of a resolution in the case of the World Bank, in the sense that the World Bank does provide subsidized credit to developing countries, and then asks them to undertake environmental or other policies that they might not undertake otherwise. And so that's a sort of a trade.
That's what I was more talking about, is that now they'll be able to avoid those, environmental things. I'm not like a tree hugger or anything. That's just what I'm basing it off, that's going to take away those costs, and I could be more keen to be able to do that.
And the answer is we don't know.
I just think it would hurt the domestic workers more so, and that might be why the U.S. is avoiding it.
It might, and it might lead to policies that we and the Europeans don't like as much. But in the broader sweep of things, maybe this is an inevitable component part of the fact that the world economy is no longer as completely dominated as it was 50 years ago by the rich countries, you know? I mean, we now, the G20, you know, we used to think of the management group of the world economy being the G7, and now, to some extent, it's the G20, which includes the Brazil and Russia and India and China. And, you know, the Chinese economy used to be the size of the Michigan economy. The Chinese economy today is enormous. It can't be ignored. And India in the same boat, and Brazil. And so I think to some extent, and again, I'm not making a normative argument, I'm just sort of observing, to some extent, the fact that the preferences of very rapidly growing, actually very large economies are now pushing their way into the international arena is probably inevitable. You know, it's reflected in, you know, in trade negotiations. I mean, what's going on in WTO with the Doha round is all about the influence of developing countries. For 50 years, the GATT and the WTO, developing countries played no role in it whatsoever. And now, the debate is basically between rich countries and poor countries, or middle income countries. So to some extent, this is a perhaps inevitable consequence of the successful development of a whole phalanx of emerging markets that we used to be able to ignore. We can't ignore them anymore. You know, no one can ignore China or Brazil or India in the world economy.
I'd like to ask a question before the time expires. When I was a student, a graduate student, my advisor wrote a paper, "A Thorn in the Lion's Paw." He claimed that Britain was paying too high a price to enter the then European Economic Community. Are there countries for whom it's not net beneficial, from your perspective, to be in the EU right now?
Yeah, well, if you ask, there are increasing numbers of Europeans who would say yes to that question, which is new. I mean, if you look at the public opinion polls, typically, and you ask a very simple question, there are specific policies that people may disagree on, but if you ask a simple question, is, do you think the European Union is a good thing or a bad thing for your country? Those numbers have been, since they've been asked, which is like the last 30 years, they've been in the 70s for almost every country. And now, you know, so 70% say it's, or more say it's a good thing, and 20 to 30% say it's a bad thing. Now, in some countries like Greece, Bulgaria, Portugal, Spain, you're heading down towards 50. And I believe there are a couple of countries that are below 50%. Right? So the unpopularity or the crisis has had a real impact on the popularity of European integration. And you know, the UK is, of course, one of the most Euro-skeptical of countries. In the most recent European Parliament, not national elections, but elections for the European Parliament, the biggest party was the so-called United Kingdom Independence Party, which wants to pull out of the EU. They didn't win a majority of the votes, but they won a plurality. They won more than Labour and the Conservatives. So there are certainly a lot of people in the EU that think that. I can only give you my opinion, which is that when we think of what European integration means, which is largely the most important thing it means, is the elimination of all barriers to the movement of goods and capital. Right? I mean, at this point, whatever else the European Union may be, it is a single market for goods and capital, a common financial market, a common goods market. It's hard to believe that that's not good for just about every country in the European Union. And it's especially good for the small countries. I mean, you don't see Estonia, Lithuania, you know, Slovenia talking about leaving the European Union because they're tiny, you know, and they need that access to that market. But then there are questions about things like the euro and financial regulation, which is highly contested, and some of the other regulatory functions of the European Union, which are highly contested. And there, I think the evidence is mixed. My own personal view is, I tend to think that on net, European integration is good for the countries in question. Some of the things that get the most attention are, frankly, trivial. So if you read the press, you would think that German or Dutch taxpayers were paying zillions of dollars to finance Malta and Montenegro and Cyprus and Portugal. In fact, the actual transfers of funds are very small. I would say, and there is some very substantial evidence that Germany has benefited tremendously by the creation of the European Union and by the creation of the euro. I mean, the single biggest growth area of the German economy in the last 15 years has been exports to the eurozone, right? And the single biggest target for German in investment has been the EU members in Central and Eastern Europe. So even Germany, the biggest country in the EU, has benefited from it. You know, again, it's a trade-off. So if you're Danish, for example, or Swedish, come from one of the Scandinavian social democracies, you say, well, you know, our Danish or Swedish style of welfare state is threatened by the European Union, and we don't like that. So a lot of it might depend on where you sit within Danish politics, right? But you have to think that for a country as small as Denmark or Sweden, not being in the European Union would involve substantial costs. So I would say on net it's positive.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. What you're looking for?
Yep, absolutely. So if you feel free to come 7 o'clock just across the hall, he'll be giving his lecture. It'll be about 7 to 9. So feel free to eat the pizza.